Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and this is another Ask Me Anything at this unusual time of day. Hopefully, we will get a few newbies. If you are new to World War II TV in terms of watching live, please be brave enough to join in the chat in the sidebar there. The regulars don't bite. Well, Willie might, but he's had his jabs, so you'll be fine. So the purpose of these AMAs is to kind of bring people in, have a bit of a chat. People who don't know much about me can find out more about me and my obscurities and the things I like and the things I don't like, etc., etc. Morning, George. Morning, Nikki. Morning, Roderick. So let's start with a little bit about what is coming up on World War II TV, because we have a lot coming your way. I haven't scheduled everything yet. So in terms of September, we have this week, which is our first War Crimes Week. There's a second War Crimes Week, the third week of September. In between those weeks, we have what I'm loosely calling an infantry week, but there are a couple of battles that include tanks and armor as well. Then we move on after the third week, which is War Crimes Week 2, to a longer kind of 10 days where we look at various generals in World War II. Then beyond that, in October, we've got weeks looking at armored battles. We've got another War Crimes Week. We have got some sort of general shows, SOE, things like that don't fit into exact categories. We've got some regular World War II TV guests returning. We've got a lot of newbies. We've got all sorts of things coming your way, which I'm looking forward to. So, in fact, I will throw up some images. I wasn't going to do this. Then about 2 minutes ago, I thought I would do this. So these are some of the shows we've got coming up. They're in no particular order. I just threw them into a PowerPoint in no order. So this is what I'm looking forward to with Joseph. Saipan, we didn't do as much Pacific content this summer as perhaps I thought we would, because there were so many other 80th anniversaries to look at. But Joseph is one of those guests, along with Eric we had last week, who's talking about his father's unit. So it's a deep connection to this unit of Marine Scout Snipers. This show will include Lee Marvin stories. We've talked about Lee Marvin before with his biographer Dwayne Epstein a couple of years ago, but Lee Marvin was involved in this unit here. So that's one we've got coming up. I'll just go through these. Richard Hargreaves, you may remember, came on a few weeks ago now talking about Barbarossa. And I think people were very surprised by the personal stories that Richard shared. It wasn't sort of an operational study about this army group going there, this army group going there. It was more about the repercussions, what was happening on the ground in Barbarossa. Well, this is him returning to talk about Breslau, which is now Wrocław in Poland. I was there in November last year. And one of the sort of fortress cities, and the fighting there in Silesia, very important. Looking forward to discussing that with Richard. So that's something coming up. I'll keep on going through these as I'm doing these. Fire away with questions. I won't get to all of them, but I'll get to some of them. This one I haven't scheduled yet because David O'Keefe is an incredibly busy person. But this is a series I'm doing where we look at the stereotypes of the nationalities that form part of the Allies in World War II. So we're having one about the Canadian soldier, the Canuck. We're having one about Digger, the Australian soldier. That's next week with Peter Williams. One about Tommy with Peter Hart. I will find someone to do Yank at some point. I contacted a couple of people who couldn't do it, but I will keep on looking. I mean, there's plenty of people who can talk about that. I might do Marine, about the US Marines. I might do ones about German and Japanese soldiers. Don't know yet. Well, but this is the beginning of a series. This is one of the armored battles shows we've got coming up in October. Bill Warnock is another dedicated historian to just one unit, in this case the 741st Tank Battalion, who of course took part on D-Day, but then carried on all the way through to the end of the war. So that's going to be another show of very, very intimate detail, if you like, about a particular unit. I'm looking forward to that one, and I hope that will be the first of several visits. This is the Digger show we have about the Australian soldier, and that's next week with Peter Williams. That'll be about this time of day. In fact, I think it's Monday next week. So it'll be about 10 o'clock in the morning UK time, something like that. Peter Williams is a great historian, as you know. Jonathan Horn is a new first-time guest on World War II TV. He did a fantastic book, The Fate of the Generals, about the Philippines. So I noticed Tonit's in the sidebar. So hopefully you'll enjoy that one. Jonathan Horn has been to the Philippines. He's been a guest of Dares and other people out there, Tony Ferredo and what have you. And his book is about that, the leadership issues and the dynamics between MacArthur and Wainwright, as long as the ground battle. Looking forward to that one. This one's a really interesting one. Gautam contacted me a few weeks ago, and he moves between India and the UK. And this is a look at the Indian prisoners of war, how they were treated, their attitudes towards the British, their attitudes towards the Japanese, etc., etc. Again, those of you who are regulars, you know I like to bring people in with that specific kind of local knowledge, and you know, this is the complications of identity within the wider Indian army, the British Indian army, as some people call it, etc. Fred is saying that the Faith of the General is a great book. It is a great book. I concur completely. So that's another show we've got coming up about Indians. This one, I read this book on holiday, and if you've seen the film Uprising, about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Lily what's her name? Lily Sobolowski, or whatever her name was, who's retired from acting, was in it. Donald Sutherland was in it. What's his name? Who does the voice of Mo in The Simpsons? Hank Azaria was in it, and this covers some of the female, incredibly brave fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Looking forward to that one. That'll be good. That's, I think, in October or November. This is going to be next week, I think. Steve Erskine works at the Green Howards Museum. It's hopefully, again, the first of a series of shows about the Green Howards in World War II. I know certain people on the sidebar, like Ian T, Ian Carr, Willie, they like their British subjects covered. It is, I have to say, a little bit trickier finding British guests than it is to find US guests. I'm not quite sure why, but it is. But that's what I'm looking forward to, about a good old solid county regiment in World War II. Craig is doing 2 shows in the next few weeks. This is the second one, in fact, based on his new book about Guderian's panzers. So Operation Barbarossa, up to the point where it all starts going wrong for them. But before that, he's on in another show, which I'll get to that slide in a little bit, which is sort of a travelogue, how it was when he visited that site. We're going to hear about how this is about another battlefield. I'll get to that in a minute, but this is one I'm looking forward to. This is actually part of the Generals series we've got coming up. Jeff McGovern, who you know is ex-US Airborne, but now in the US Air Force. He's based in the UK now. He is doing one about James Gavin. He did one about Paul Williams recently, and he goes into sort of very objective detail about what the archives say. And James Gavin has been one of those generals that has fallen off his perch slightly in recent years, mostly due to James Holland's re-evaluation of his performance in the Battle of Market Garden. Prior to then, I think he was regarded as one of the best generals of World War II. And I still think he probably is one of the best airborne commanders of World War II. I do also agree he didn't perform to his best in Market Garden, maybe because he'd hurt his back. We'll find out about that with Jeff. That'll be the end of this month. I think that's the 26th or something. This one won't be till late October, maybe November. James Fenelon, you may know from his 4 Hours of Fury about Operation Varsity. He's putting together a show about Japanese soldiers in World War II. And we haven't done enough about the Japanese because there aren't enough people who have studied it to the level of detail that we appreciate here on this channel. But James has done some cracking work investigating Japanese. It might end up being Japanese paratroopers and Marines. I don't know yet, but that's what it is right now. Keep on going. This is an interesting one. This is the people who contacted me. I didn't know about Monique's work. This French general is one of those guys, when you hear this show, you'll feel you should know who he is, and yet you probably won't know the name. There he is in the background photo there next to Leclerc. So he's part of the French Second Army Division. So this is North Africa, and then through to Paris and on to the end of the war. And one of the most decorated French soldiers of all time. Looking forward to that. So Monique is the French historian, and then she was helped out by Jason for some the translations and Americanisms, if you like, about that. So I'm looking forward to that. They sent me their book a few weeks ago. Dave Holland is going to be coming on twice. If you haven't been keeping up with things, his new book about fighting on Guadalcanal is out, or it's out in some places, pre-order, other places. He's going to do at least 2 shows to be over the next few weeks. I think this one is next week. And there'll be quite a few shows in September where I'm doing, or days in September where I'm doing 2 shows a day, one in the morning, one in the evening, or depending on where you are in the world, because of so many people to fit in. I'm looking forward to speaking to Dave with his weird comedy Australian Southern USA accent, because he's an American Marine who has been living in Australia for decades. Looking forward to that. We'll just see what he has to say in that. Looking forward to that. Andrew Harrison is coming back on. Remember, he did a show about Monty and the Battle for Caen and what is said in the archives and what Monty himself said. We felt there was more to explore with that. So he's coming back to carry on about Monty and what Monty said and what people said about Monty. So that's looking at Normandy again. We may touch on Market Garden. I don't know. We'll see. Looking forward to that. I think that is the 30th of September. This is the show I talked about with Craig, and Craig is a highly regarded Eastern Front historian, a friend of Douglas Nash, who's a regular on World War II TV. So we've talked about the Battle of Rzhev before with Prit Buttar, but what Craig will bring to this show is the fact he spent a lot of time there. So there'll be lots of photos. Now, he did take these photos some years ago on a film camera, so they aren't necessarily the highest quality compared to a digital huge photo that we take these days on our phones. But it'll be really interesting to hear his experiences traveling through sort of the central part of their area there, which is sort of from Moscow out. Looking forward to that one with Craig. That's, I think, next week. Ilya was part of the series we did about the book about the Soviet-German war, edited by Jeff Rutherford. He was in a double header, and he was talking about Lend-Lease aircraft. But I really liked Ilya's approach to data and statistics. So he's coming back to look specifically, well, you can see it there in the title, in the P-39 Air Cobra, which I realize is spelled wrong. I've got to change that. It says Aero Cobra. I'll change that one later on. Embarrassing. I'll do that later on. Looking forward to that. But I will change the title. John Parshall, who doesn't love a John Parshall? He's appearing in our Generals Week, and he's looking particularly, as you can see on the slide there, at Percival and Yamashita in Malaya and Singapore. We don't talk enough about Malaya on the channel. In fact, people generally don't talk enough about Malaya. Ross Cable, the Australian, has done some stuff with us about Malaya. I'm going to try and get other historians over the next couple of years to look at this, because don't forget, next year 2026 will be is sort of an open one. We won't be dealing with 80th anniversary stuff, so we can go back and look at 42 and 43 and other years, and that, looking forward to that one. Who doesn't love listen to John? Glyn is, as you know, is a New Zealand historian. Every time he's been on the channel before, he has been talking about a New Zealand specific subject, but not this time. His latest book, Quite a Talent for Fighting, is about Truscott. And if you follow World War II TV, you know John McManus is a big fan of Truscott. I like Truscott. I think James Holland likes Truscott. He didn't perhaps get to the heights of being an army commander, but he was in the photo we showed last night with John McManus in the A2 flying jacket next to Mark Clark. So I'm really looking forward to a New Zealander's point of view about who I think is one of the best generals. Good morning, Norma. Or yeah, it is very, very early in the morning for you. Indeed, Tony, it's a great lineup of shows, and I haven't done graphics for all of them yet. So these are just some of the ones I have done. This will be next week. I think this is next week. This is one of those units that none of us will know very much at all about, because it's an Army infantry division who fought in the Pacific. The 32nd are mentioned in John McManus's book, but Mark has done lots of work following this division, particularly. Looking forward to that one. Who doesn't like a thorough, good following of a division from when they were formed to when they kind of ceased their operations around the time of the end of the war? Looking forward to that one. Peter has done another fantastic book, again going back to the book we talked about earlier about MacArthur in the Philippines. Peter has also looked at this, and his book is called Redemption, and it is about the campaign for the Philippines, mostly the retaking of the Philippines, but looking back to the loss of the Philippines. Peter is highly regarded. Looking forward to that one. There's a few more of these, and I'll do some questions. John McManus is coming back to talk about Ridgeway. He talked about them last night, and I was very impressed by John's discipline in not going into too much detail about Ridgeway, because he knew and I knew that he's coming back to talk about Ridgeway in a special as part of our general series. I think this might end up being in October because I'm just so rammed solid in September, and John is back to teaching as it's term time. But that's a famous detail attributed to Ridgeway, that no ground gain was ever relinquished to a unit under his command, which is interesting. So looking forward to looking at him. That's a subject of John's latest book, which is not out yet. I don't even think it's finished yet. Zita, you may remember from a few years ago, she did a fantastic panel show with Peter Caddick-Adams and John Parshall about Rommel and Montgomery in the desert. She then did a second show about some of the Rommel's defeats after El Alamein. And she's coming back to look at basically how the hell did Rommel put his leadership package together. Now, she is sort of unashamedly someone who appreciates Rommel's talents. I'm not quite as vehemently in his favor as she is, but that'll make for a lively conversation. But this will be about where he learned, what he learned from. Perhaps we'll get into the heady subject of how not very good he was at logistics, etc., etc. We will see, but I'm looking forward to that one. Indeed, Fred, Peter is very impressive. He was Petraeus' as chief of staff, and he ran up before retiring and becoming a scholar. So yes, you're right. He has that military background as well as being a good, solid historian. Looking forward to that one. Do a few more of these, then we'll do questions. It won't be to the end of October. You may follow Chris on Facebook, and he's part of the independent company We Have Ways. So this is their theory that the crash that killed Sikorsky was deliberate. It was sabotage. This is the Liberator that crashed in 1943, the Polish commander there. Looking forward to that one, because it's sort of part of our general show, but it's also a kind of an aviation mystery. We did one very, very early in the early days about the loss of Glenn Miller. So it's sort of in that field, that era. There'll also be some shows that are both about SOE and romances. And this one is, she's a very famous Canadian journalist. I think, Norma, hopefully you can come in and add some information about how well known Nala is. But she's coming on to talk about two SOE agents, one Canadian, one British. And they didn't serve together, but they were united and they fought together in World War II. Looking forward to that one. There's another one about SOE. Helen Fry is coming on to do an SOE. I haven't done the graphic for that one yet, and I probably will invite Dr. Kate Vigers to come on and talk about SOE. So we might have a series of shows about SOE. And there's another one about a couple. He was in the Air Force and she wasn't, that I haven't done yet, but that'll probably squeeze that into that same week so that we have a week of SOE stroke romance type content. Looking forward to that one. This is next week. Philip Watson was on World War I TV and he was on World War II TV. And this is back to 1940. Ian T will like this one because it's about British action, and the 12th Lancers, one of those units in the rear guard of the defense of Dunkirk. So this is armored cars holding the line, forming an action for the British to retreat to Dunkirk. Philip's done a fantastic book about that. Looking forward to that one. This is the Tommy version of the shows I'm talking about. I don't know when that'll be because Peter Hart is spending a lot of September over in Gallipoli, having fun there, doing stuff. No, Norma, I didn't know she did historical stuff. Top-notch journalist. Yeah, well, this, I think, is her first proper, pure historical book, Norma. So she's coming on. So looking forward to that. That back to the show about the SOE. Michael Ackerman, we had to reschedule this one because of family issues, his side of the Atlantic. I will reschedule this at some point where we do his reassessment of Vierville-sur-Mer following his visit to Normandy in June. And looking forward to that one. Don't know when that'll be because I'm absolutely rammed this month. You'll be getting more than your buck's worth. This is the one I was talking about Craig visiting the battlefields of Rzhev. I'm looking forward to that one. I told you I will tell you about that later earlier. This is his photos of the battlefield. Looking forward to that. That's next week on the Wednesday, possibly. This isn't until October. Roger Morehouse is doing the rounds now with his new book that's coming out soon about U-boats, Wolfpack. Roger wanted to come on. Roger's coming on. He'll be doing all the big podcasts as at the time of the release of his book. But Roger is always good value for money. Looking forward to that one. And that's it of the graphics I have created. So that is just some of what we have coming up. As I say, quite often I'm doing 2 shows a day over the next few weeks. So for those of you who are not able to keep up with all the content, it just gives you even more of a challenge to try and keep up. And yes, Trevor, yes, we haven't talked about that recently, but Trevor is going to be hopefully doing a couple of Tunisia talks. Ian Mitchell wrote the great book about Long Stop Hill, so we're going to work on that at some point. Another World War II TV contributor in the sidebar, and also a contributor as a historian or an historian, depending on how you prefer your language to be said. Right, let's look at some questions. Okay, so let's go back to what I've always looked at. So Market Garden. I'm not going to go to great lengths talking about Market Garden because we will do some more Market Garden stuff in the future. But there is some debate, Rodney, about whether or not there was a coup de main aspect of a Market Garden ever part of the Market Garden plan, or whether it was part of Comet, because this is where you get into the complications of which part of the airborne operation into Netherlands was Montgomery's part, which bit becomes Brereton and the First Allied Airborne Army's part, and who was in charge of what and what have you. But I have to say, this is sort of separate to who intended it and what may have been written down at the time, is that the landing of the 6 Horsa gliders, well, 5 landed right where they were supposed to, 1 miles away, by Pegasus and Horsa bridges in Normandy by the Ox and Bucks, was one of the absolute, how would you call it, top working, fantastically successful parts of the airborne operation in Normandy. And I do wonder why something from that model couldn't have been put aside for future airborne operations. Now, that would have meant, if you use the same guys, that you move Ox and Bucks, that battalion, or even just that company, from 6th Airborne to 1st Airborne. But I think it could have been done. And I think a coup de main force of a few gliders landing right near Arnhem Bridge might have made a bit of a difference to the plan there. I mean, you know, in the long term, it gets very difficult because there are so many variables into play there. But I think not having some sort of coup de main part of Market Garden was a mistake among many mistakes made in Market Garden. So that would be my answer. Is I don't know quite why it wasn't part of it. Was it considered? Some people say it was, some people say it wasn't, but it was definitely something I think would have made a difference. This, Greg, you mentioned ration packs. And I have thought about doing some stuff about rations. In fact, I've got a couple of friends from my old reenactment days who are particularly hot on ration packs and things like that. And the reason I haven't done it is it's been covered by some very, very good people on other YouTube channels. In fact, there's one particular guy whose name has escaped me for the moment, who has investigated all the ration packs. One of the interesting things is that I don't know that what food people had in the line made a particular difference to the success of operations. I think soldiers grumble about food when they're not in the line. They will grumble about their boots, they'll grumble about the food, they'll grumble about officers grumbling at them. But I think when you're fighting, providing you're getting something to sustain you, I don't know there's that much grumbling if you're in the middle of an operation. But it is worth looking at some point on the channel about how in World War II, the Allied nations, by which I mean the English-speaking ones, did develop these sort of packed up, if you like, disposable rations. The Americans started with the C rations, which were tinned rations. Then they went to the K rations, which came in the waxed cardboard boxes. The British started with sort of compo crates, so that's compo short for composite rations, which were big kind of wooden crates full of tinned biscuits, tinned products, packets of biscuits, packets of this, packets of that. And then as the war went on, they also developed some more individual packs, notably the 24-hour ration pack used for D-Day and operations like that, which, like the K ration, was a waxed cardboard box that had just the right amount, so they said, of calories for a fighting soldier in one day. But, and I am unashamedly a Normandy person, if you look at the Normandy campaign, there aren't many cases of British Canadian Army units not getting hot rations brought up pretty much every day from the rear lines. This is the example we've talked about a lot about the big war that the Allies are able to bring to bear in World War II. And the fact that maybe at the front of the point of the spear, sometimes the Germans had better stuff than the Allies had. Maybe we can talk about the tanks. Maybe we can talk about some of the machine guns, although I don't necessarily agree with that. But certainly in the support, the British and Americans have things that much better, much more motorization, much more mechanization generally, and they have the people who can do that repairing of tanks, the repairing of vehicles, the supplying of ammunition, all that kind of stuff. And you remember the show we did about landing craft types. We did a couple with Andrew Whitmarsh and Stephen Fish, and we talked about, the bakery landing craft that the Allies had, the bakery trucks they had in Normandy, so they can produce hundreds of fresh loaves of bread every day. The ability to do all that stuff, that's something the Allies have that the Germans really didn't have. So ration packs are important to some extent. It gives a soldier an ability to provide food for himself if he doesn't get food coming up. But actually, I'm not sure about places like Tunisia, Trevor, when the logistics are more complicated. But certainly in the ETO, broadly speaking, the Allies were very good at feeding their troops. Not always. You get situations like the siege of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne, they can't get the supply trucks in. They are relying much more on the K rations and the C rations. And it's a war movie trope. Of course it is, of character A saying, what flavor tin of stuff have you got? That is one of those things that they talk about, the poor quality of rations. But that, as I said a minute ago, is the kind of thing soldiers will grumble about, because soldiers sometimes don't feel fair to grumble about battles where their mates got killed, or if a leader did something that he shouldn't have done. But grumbling about rations is sort of neutral, isn't it? You can just grumble about the food you're getting, a sort of a generic grumble. And I think that's why we've got this idea that the food that soldiers got was pretty poor. The reality is, if you look at a lot of the men who were in the British, Canadian, American armies, coming out of the Depression, coming out of the recession, coming out of all those things they came out of, the food they were getting in the army was arguably better than food they were getting at home before the war. Certainly, you could make the case that men at the front line, the British Army, were getting more meat, more eggs, even if it was powdered eggs, even if it was processed meat, than their wives and their families back home. Rationing probably affects civilians more than it affects the frontline soldier. But that's another subject for another day. And thanks for sharing the detail about empty ration tins there. I'll look for some more questions as we go on. Willie says, in one of the videos from Best Defense Foundation, I saw you sat on the steps in Saint-Lô with Papa Jake Larson. How profound was that conversation? That's a really good question, Willie. It came about quite sort of randomly. I don't do much stuff with the Best Defense Foundation, even though I've known Donnie Edwards and Catherine for a long time. I leave that because I think it's appropriate. That's Mag's thing. Mag does that every year, and I kind of join in a little bit, but I have other things to do in June. So I go to a couple of the evenings, I do a couple of things, and I was at one of the evenings in Caen where all the veterans stay, and it came up that Papa Jake had been to Omaha Beach several times, but hadn't been to Saint-Lô. Now, interestingly, he didn't think he'd actually been through Saint-Lô in 1944, but being part of operations and his role within 5th Corps, Saint-Lô had been the subject on everybody's lips for all the first 6 weeks of the Normandy campaign, so he wanted to see it. So, long story short, while the buses of veterans went somewhere else, Jake and his carers were brought to Saint-Lô, where I met them in Saint-Lô, and I gave them a little kind of potted tour of Saint-Lô for an hour or two. We did some filming there, and we tried to get Jake to talk about it. Now, what's interesting, and this kind of connects with what I was saying about how veterans recall things in that show I did, the impromptu one last week, is that a lot of what Jake was talking about when he was talking about Saint-Lô was really the Falaise Gap. He was talking about lots of dead German horses and flies and dead cattle and things like that. And I realized that the way he had processed it, and he was, 101 years, or was he 102 years old, where we, who understand the campaign, maybe put a very distinct separation between the Battle of Saint-Lô and the Battle of the Falaise Gap. For him, it was all part of that inland chapter. He has his specific memories about coming ashore at Omaha Beach, which he's shared many times, but his Saint-Lô things, he was talking about the two as if they were sort of the two ends of the same operation, which I, as a historian, wouldn't necessarily call it, but that's how he perceived it. So that was really interesting. And you could tell by how moved he was when he was talking about the horses, being the dead horses and the columns of dead Germans as well, that even though it was 81 years later, he was still very moved by the sights he had seen. And we took him to the Major Howie roundabout, to the statue of Major Howie, and that's where he took his hat off and saluted. And they got that in the film, the promo film that came out. So yeah, it was a profound conversation, but in a way, it ended up not quite being about Saint-Lô, but Saint-Lô became the visual stimulus, singular, to provoke a conversation about stuff later on in the Normandy campaign that perhaps he hadn't talked about much before. So it was pretty profound for him, and profound for me, and for those who were watching or listening in, I suppose. Fred is saying he met Gautam, who's did this show about the Indian prisoners of war earlier this year in Singapore. So I'm looking. So that's nice. I like it when people have known each other. And talking about prisoners of war, Greg is also adding that the Germans didn't like Maori prisoners of war. The Germans had a very odd attitude to lots of things in World War II. And it would be worth at some point in the future investigating, for example, how they were treating the black French troops captured in 1940, and basically terribly is the simple way of describing that. But at other points during the war, in Italy, for example, Gurkhas, they didn't just treat everybody who was darker skinned terribly. They didn't treat many of them well, but they had different sort of standards for different peoples based on, I guess, some sort of combat respect they were getting from people. But it'd be easy just to say the Third Reich hated everybody who wasn't white, and it is. I'm not saying that isn't true, folks, but when it came to prisoners of war, there are other variables that come into place about how they treated various people. So there we are. War brides, you're also mentioning, you're throwing in lots of questions there, Greg. War brides is something I probably will touch next year for the 80th anniversary of 1946, because that's probably the 45 people are still being demobbed and leaving the army. I think 46 is maybe the peak year of war brides, and there's that famous photo of the decks of whichever ship it is absolutely heaving with people going back to, I forget whether that ship's going to USA or Canada. It might be going to both. So I will be looking at war brides because, and this is the way my random brain works, is that war brides, it's a very romantic idea that people found love in the war, and then had these happy marriages that lasted for years. And of course, that did happen sometimes, but it also didn't happen. People leaving their home, and it wasn't just like English-speaking war brides. Americans took back Polish brides and German brides, and British people took back brides, and British and American people settled in Japan and took brides there, and British people went to Malaya. A whole a variety of cultural alignments occurred as marriages after World War II, and sometimes it didn't work very well. So it's something that would be worth looking at. There's a film with Anna Friel as a British war bride going to Canada, I think, where it talks about, and I'm going on to a wonderful woody tangent there. And one of my favorite my middling favorite pop bands is Squeeze. And Squeeze did a fantastic, they're probably known best for Up the Junction, but their songs are very much little novellas where they told the whole story there. And look up the lyrics for Labeled with Love. Labeled with Love came out in 1981. And it is about a war bride. I'm reading some lyrics right for you now. So one of the verses goes, during the wartime, an American pilot made every air raid a time of excitement. She moved his prairie and married a Texan. She looked from a distance. Our love was a lesson. He became drinker and she became mother. She knew that one day she'd be one or the other. He ate himself older, drank himself dizzy, proud of her features. She kept herself busy, pretty. And it goes on about how she ends up having to return to the UK and kind of dies an alcoholic in poverty, really. So that's a song about war brides, and it's an interesting tangent that sometimes I think of the two various things I like in my life as being separate. So my interest in World War II is very separate to my interest in the music I grew up with. But the music I grew up with was written by people like Squeeze, whose parents had lived through the war. And so sometimes the war came through in the lyrics, and you get that in certain punk records where they're looking at empire, they're looking at the government. So in a weird way, there is a connection between pop music of the 1970s, 80s, and World War II, because the people who wrote the pop music had parents who lived through the war and they grew up with that. You could also argue that the rock and roll explosion in World War II in 1955, 56, Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, all that kind of stuff, is a reaction to their square parents. Well, their square parents were people like Wild Bill Garnier and Dick Winters and Desmond Doss and Eugene Sledge, who went back to the USA and didn't want anything particularly exciting in their lives because they'd had all the excitement they needed with World War II. So they went back to the kind of the safe music perhaps they'd been listening to before the war, the big bands, the swing and things like that. And their kids then found that their parents were square because they were listening to boring music. Out of that comes rock and roll. Norma Graham just mentioning When the Tigers Broke Free by Pink Floyd. Yeah. Roger Waters, all that. So and there's now a bigger conversation about Squeeze going on in a sidebar there. Yes, so that's cool. So Pulling Out Muscles for Michelle, another fantastic song, Roderick. Cool the Cats, indeed. Yeah. Trevor's adding back the conversation about prisoners of war and how they were treated. Von Armin refused to be taken prisoner in Tunisia by black troops, which included, in his mind, Gurkhas. So he had a rather, one brush fits all approach to that's not the right. I'm mixing my metaphors there, but that they were all, anybody was non-white were not nice. So there we are. We've done war brides and the not always romantic ideal of war brides. Norma is saying, can McManus come on and talk about Eichelberger? I'd love to have Mike Manners come on and talk about Eichelberger. And he has in the past. We did do a show with John where he talked about Eichelberger's campaign, sort of in 42, 43. But it's worth bringing him back again. And yeah, Nick Hewitt about Admiral Ramsey would be good. That I'll make a mental note of that, Norma. We have done a few shows on Tonnet, on Churchill Tonnet. I call it my Churchill Reassessed series. Every now and then we've looked at it. So we did, off the top of my head, Catherine Carter came on and talked about Churchill's meetings at Chartwell with various world leaders and influential figures in the 1930s when he was sort of outside of politics to some extent. That's we've done that. We've done shows about his relationship with Stalin, and there'll be more Churchill shows in the future. The difficulty with Churchill, to some extent, as a host of a channel, is that he's somewhat Marmite these days, far more loved than he is hated. But when subjects like the famine in India come up, you get people who are blaming him for it, the real radical anti-Churchill, anti-imperial people, and you get the absolute people who celebrate Churchill won't have a bad word said against him. I'm somewhere in the middle, although much more of the I'm a fan of his than I'm against his, but I don't think he's perfect. And difficulty is finding people, historians in the middle area, who aren't either sycophants to Churchill or they hate him. Sycophants is a very strong word. So yeah, it's quite complicated to schedule Churchill stuff because of that dilemma, is that people tend to have decided in advance that they love him or hate him. I want to do more of a neutral thing, but yeah, there'll be more Churchill stuff coming up. Of course there will in the future. Kevin is asking, is there an aspect of the Normandy campaign you haven't covered or you need to do more? Well, absolutely. Yeah. And it's the same old. It's the inland stuff, Operation Bluecoat, Operation Goodwood. Now, I would have liked to have covered some of those operations when the 80th anniversaries are happening. And part of the reason I didn't is that I didn't just want to do a single show, for example, about Operation Goodwood, or a single show about Operation Cobra. I would rather have done a week about Goodwood or Cobra. And so fitting in a week about Cobra in the 80th anniversary, when it would also there was also 80th anniversaries of things happening in Philippine Sea, for example, or the Eastern Front, Bagration, is much harder. But as we have the next couple of years, 2026, 27, 28, we won't be covering 80th anniversary stuff. At that point, I can then do a week about Operation Bluecoat, a week about the attritional phase, a week about the breakout of Cobra to Avranches. So we'll have different historians on. So we don't just do a cursory, hey, here's 15 minutes talking about Cobra. Isn't pattern great? Blah, blah, blah. We go into some depth there. So that will be something we will go. I may even go back and look at some of June the 6th again, although I think I've probably done most of the subjects on June the 6th to some degree over the 5 years here, but definitely the attritional phase. And you know, picking up those individual unit things where we follow, like I don't know, the 50th Division. Well, we did that with Terry Down a few weeks ago, but some of the other units there, some of the more obscure units that come in later on. And by obscure, I don't mean obscure. I mean less talked about than the D-Day units. So I don't know, the British 49th West Riding Division, the 59th Staffordshire Division, the American 8th Infantry Division, the 9th Infantry Division, the units that don't get as much attention. We did one on the 83rd with Myra Miller last year. So yes, lots more about Normandy. But what's become interesting in my doing this is that I have absolutely gone from being a Normandy guy to a world war guy. It does mean that I'm losing a bit of my Normandy knowledge, because everything new that comes in the front pushes something else at the back. And when I started, I think people would have seen me very much as a Normandy guy, but I have branched out, and I still find Normandy interesting, but I want to do more stuff. So just to clarify about the Churchill stuff. So the series is called Churchill Reassessed, but I didn't have a week about Churchill. I kind of just did an odd Churchill show every now and then, but I think there's 5 or 6 videos that are under the Churchill Reassessed label, Lorelei and Tonnet and the others there. Yeah, so that while we're on that subject, the walkthroughs with then and now comparisons, that was very much an early part of what we did on World War II TV, where I had the guides, friends of mine out there on the battlefields. Of course, the problem with that is plagued with difficulties, plagued with internet failures. The quality of the camera work, because of the internet signal, was really bad. Often they were fun, and we were all friends then, and people were very forgiving for what was going on then. But I haven't returned to do much of that stuff again, partly because it limits me to Normandy and where I know where someone's around the world. But also, as I said, they're very hard to put together. More recently, when I have done stuff of that ilk, it has been when I have gone out and done some videoing with decent quality camera in advance, and then we upload the videos while we're talking. And I probably will be. We did that with Arthur Glaxon about the fighting Operation Atlantic, Operation Spring, that last year. So they were fun. The other thing is that the people who were doing it for me, Mag and Duncan, now isn't in Normandy anymore, Colin, they're working. They're busy guys. I can't expect them to work, you know, all the time they're working on tours and then go out in the evening and stand in the field for me. That was very much a COVID era thing. And although I enjoyed doing them, and although we kind of got through with all the clunkiness of the internet, I look back on them very fondly, but it's probably not the direction I'm going to be going with World War II TV in the future. And partly it's because the proliferation of fantastic YouTube content creators like JD, you know, History Underground, History Explorer, who's in the sidebar today, they're doing much better stuff than I could do, because they're filming live, but then they're editing and they're adding the maps and the overlays later on. And so they're doing a better version of what I was doing in a different way for a different reason, if that makes sense. Yeah, you should go back to sleep, Norma, but you don't have 4 o'clock in the morning. It's a stupid time to be up. Did you just get up just to see me, or did you get up because you were really bored or something? So yeah, that the early shows were fun. But I don't know that I'll be going back that way as well. It was good. It was like it was like the early albums, you know. It was like when, I don't know, when the Beatles were doing their kind of covers of other people's music. It was fun. It was good. But then they moved on to doing their own stuff. And I think what we're doing now and bringing in the historians that we do, I think is probably more of what I want to do, and is easier to manage as well. So. Yeah, I'll go find some more questions because there's not that many of you here today. But this is an interesting comment from Bob. It sounds dry, but I would like to unpack how history is selected for GCSEs in the UK, perhaps how Eurocentric our view in World War II is and how it shaped our learnings. Well, so that's the British qualification for sort of 16-year-olds and what have you, and A levels and degrees. I don't know that actually looking at how curriculums are set up is something I really want to tackle. I think it's probably a job better suited to academics who have the understanding of that. But I definitely am with you on how and I don't necessarily think it's just Eurocentric, it's our where we're from centric view of history. And I still think that if you go in to a bookshop in the Philippines, you get books written by Philippine based authors about the Philippines. You go into a shop in Australia, you get books about Gallipoli in the First World War, Tobruk in the Second World War, the Kokoda Trail, depending on which version you appreciate in terms of language. In Britain, you get shows about books about the Dam Busters and the Battle of Britain and Market Garden, written by British authors. Of course, there are some authors that have international reach, James Holland, John McManus. But I think all of us are learning our history centered through the country we're from, where our culture, our war films, our ways of talking about it all are very, very centered through our national lens. And out of that, you get the mythology, and whenever I talk about Britain being alone, which I think is a myth in 1940, I always get a very angry response from someone who'll say, Britain absolutely was alone in 1940. You can't count Canada. You can't count India. They weren't there being bombed. They weren't there. And I take on board their points. When I'm saying Britain wasn't alone in 1940, I mean it more figuratively than literally. Yes, there sort of was a point in 1940 when Britain, as the British Isles, was the only place sort of on the front line in the northern hemisphere, I suppose, although Finland would argue, Poland would argue about it, where you kind of feel that they're alone, but they're not really alone because Canada is starting its air training program. Australia is doing all its building up of resources, etc. And this is all part of it, the massive recruitment going on in India. So you can't take it, you can't really take it literally. And so out of these, and then from the Britain being alone in 1940, you have the awful we saved your ass in World War II thing that comes from some Americans that finds itself appearing in modern politics about Trump and presidencies and this, that, and the other. And do you want us to come and save your European asses again and all that kind of stuff? And again, there's some sort of basis on this in that none of us Brits would ever deny we could have won World War II without America's production, without Canada's incredible contribution, without what was happening from Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. And yes, the Americans did provide the bulk of the manpower come the second half of World War II. But to say they won the war on their own is stupid. We're getting feedback now. If I talk about the ETO too much, people say, but you've got to talk about the Russians. The Russians are killing all the Germans. And a lot of this is now coming from people in Russia who are feeling they're being hard done by people like myself now, because I'm not using at the moment Russian-based historians much. I didn't use much before. There was Mikhail in Stalingrad, or Volgograd came on a couple of times in early days on World War II TV. But it's hard for Russian historians to come on international channels these days because they're under certain guidelines, and by guidelines I mean rulings from their government. So it's complicated. So yes, we are in the West in an era where we are dismissing slightly more than we used to the Soviet contributions to World War II, which in turn is saying the Russian contributions to World War II. But it's understandable until Russia gets its ass out of Ukraine. Well, of course, we're going to look at it negatively. But that's I'm breaking into modern politics, which I don't want to try and do. So yeah, the trends of history, the perceptions of history through our national lens, the way we are talked to about it by our peers, by our media, by our press. I mean, look at when it's not so much now, but 20 years ago when England played Germany in football, out the newspapers would come with all the World War II symbols, and they would put, I remember there was one headline for whichever year it was, Italia 90 or something, where they put Stuart Pearce, the England defender, they put a Tommy helmet on him, and they put a German Pickelhaube on whoever the German captain was, and all this kind of stuff, stirring up this sort of national rivalry, blah, blah, blah. And it kind of makes you laugh. At the same time, you realize it's dangerous in that it's promoting stereotypes. It's not allowing for the nuanced understanding of stuff. So, so I've gone to a bit of a tangent. As is always the case. Yeah, so Bob is saying, yeah, some sort of Starlink mini setup to facilitate the live chat. Yeah, all those things are possible. Okay, so it would be great to go back to that there, but there's even with better internet connections, there's still things that can go wrong. You have to allow around the weather. What if it rains in the middle of things? The guides have to be available to be at a battlefield at a certain time. So yeah, we'll see. West African troops, Kevin. Now that is something I did begin to find contacts in Africa for people who could come on and talk about not just West African troops, but East African troops. And I'm reading Ring of Fire, Alex Churchill's First World War 1914 book right now. And it's reminding me about how much that war saw conflict and actions on African soil, and the same in World War II with Ethiopia and the Italians pushing into sort of Central Africa. The slight dilemma I've got about finding historians talk about it, and it's only a slight dilemma, and I don't have a real big problem with it, but it's the historians I'm finding who have done work on this do seem to be white, which is fine, but I feel that I would want to have Black Africans coming on and talking about African history, and as yet, I haven't found many people, anyone, of that ilk to come on who go or who've got some sort of website or profile about it. So the couple of people I found, perfectly knowledgeable, perfectly nice people, who are paying due respect to the Black Africans that they have studied. But I'm in two minds about whether to push forward with white historians talking about Black history, because it is a complicated subject these days. It's misappropriation, and it's the same could apply to things like Tuskegee Airmen and you remember on World War II TV 3 years ago or so, I had and I've completely forgotten it. Tim came on to talk about Gurkhas. Tim is a Gurkha, and he came on and talked about Gurkha history. And the thing is that there are plenty of white historians who talk about Gurkhas with great authority, who maybe had a longer grasp of Gurkha history, having studied it longer than maybe Tim did. But I still think it was absolutely wholly correct to have Tim as a Gurkha come on and talk about it. So that's something that, and it's not I'm some woke person, although I kind of am a woke person by the right definition of the word, by which I mean the left definition of the word, but by which I mean the dictionary definition of the word, not the way woke is used by some people on the far right to describe people who are, libtards and that kind of stuff, but woke in terms of trying to be tolerant to other people's points of view. In that, as I move forward, when I'm talking about indigenous peoples in World War II, I will be trying to find indigenous peoples to talk about indigenous people. Remember, we had Holly on talking about the peoples of Alaska. Well, Holly is from that area, is from that background. She was wholly appropriate to come on and talk about that. And the same thing with Gautam coming on talking about Indian prisons, where he is from that part of the world, all that kind of stuff. So as I move forward, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are people from around the world with opinions who are as valid, if not more valid, than all the parade of middle-aged white male historians. Now, I am, you may have noticed, a white middle-aged male historian. I can't help who I am. And as much as I like having John Partial and James Holland and John McManus and Craig Simons and Kevin Hemel and David O'Keefe, and the list goes on my channel, I would like to find many more people from more diverse backgrounds to talk about the subject, as well as these fantastic white middle-aged male historians. So yeah, I've gone off onto a bit of a tangent about content creating generally, but I think it's something I have to always be aware of, how subjects are being discussed, to make sure that I'm trying to keep up to date with sensibilities, with tolerance, with different viewpoints, all that kind of stuff. So, you know, I'm now see Johnny come late. I'm not avoiding the topic altogether. I'm making sure that when a topic is discussed, it is discussed from a well-rounded point of view. Okay, so it's not about ticking boxes. It's far from about ticking boxes. I mean, I could just go out into the streets of Bayeux and find someone of a different color skin to me and say, "Come on and talk about this." They may not know. They probably won't know anything about it. That's not. It's not about ticking boxes. It's about finding the most suitable person for a subject. And my suggestion is the most suitable person to talk about a subject, if the subject is about race, if the subject is about a religious aspect of participation in World War II, is someone from that field. Not only from that field, but when, for example, I've done weeks about the Philippines in World War II, 80% of my historians have been from the Philippines, or they have at least been people who have traveled extensively, lived in the Philippines, understand the Philippines. We need to move on from the days of some, historian sitting in a basement part of a university in a particular city of the world, writing about some of the other side of the world that he's never been to, or she's never been to, about peoples he or she has never interacted with, about a language he or she doesn't speak, about a culture he or she doesn't understand, and try and use the people from those areas who do understand that. Because this goes back to this perceptions, is that we will be given ideas that challenge our thinking. In that, I would love to see a day when I'm talking about Belarus, we have Belarusian historians on. If I'm talking about Singapore, we have people from Singapore. And I'm doing it. I've had guests from, I think it's now 37 different countries. So that's the point. Okay. Yeah, sorry for being so heavy at this time of the morning, David. You haven't even had your coffee yet. David, I love you, my brother. I can't wait to see you in October. He's my Irish friend that I've done some traveling to Colditz and Stalag 3 with David, and it always gives me a smile when I see your name in the sidebar. So that's good. So yeah, it's as we're saying there, it's about respectful balance. There will obviously be lots of white geezers as we move forward, but I don't want it. I want to make sure I'm thinking about why I'm bringing someone on, and it can just be because they're brilliant at communicating about the subject. And I would frankly listen to John Partial read the telephone directory if people even know what those things are anymore. So, but if I can find someone with a more nuanced, specific, detailed, local point of view, well, why I would be stupid not to bring that point on. So there we are. There you are. And thank you, Tony. I do have opinions, but you also understand that there are other points of view and you represent both fairly. I mean, and that comes up to the subject recently of me not necessarily agreeing with my guests 100%. Sometimes I agree with them 100%. Sometimes it's 50%. Sometimes it's 10%. I really enjoyed the discussions with Marcus Gibson about Bomber Command. Now, some of the points he made, I thought were really valid. Others, I thought he was pushing it a bit too far. And the viewers thought very similarly. Some people thought Marcus's shows were the best they'd seen on World War II TV this year. Others hated it from the minute it started to the minute it finished. You're not going to change that. That's people's opinions, especially when you get to complicated things that involve lots of death. Yeah. So Ian says it would be great to have Indian and Pakistani armies regimental archivists on, and there is a particular Indian historian, Mandeep, who I've been trying to get on And we've set up several shows and never quite got around to getting them because he's incredibly busy with all sorts of things, notably India's politics. And Mandeep Singh is someone I'd really like to come on. I will do it at some point. But you know, it's just getting round to it. So Roderick is asking, although as you acknowledge it, I have sort of answered that. Where do I see this channel in 5 years? Well, when I started, I really had no long-term ideas or plans at all. It was a short-term thing to combat the fact I was bored as fuck in the middle of COVID, right? And you were all bored as fuck in the middle of COVID. Now, a plan is beginning to kind of morph in that really, and it's an incredibly ambitious plan that I can't possibly achieve, which is to cover every aspect of World War II. I'll never achieve that because subjects are being discovered and written about that I can't possibly keep up with. But basically, if World War II is the center of a dartboard, right? Is that I approach it from every one of the quadrants, the sections of the dartboard. So I look at our Operation Barbarossa from the point of view of Russian historians, German historians, British historians, people looking at oral histories, people looking at how vehicles and weapons performed, people who looked at the historiography of the battle, so that over the course of, for example, my Barbarossa content, people will be able to see in a few years' time 30, 40, 50 shows about Barbarossa from a multitude of angles that together will provide a wider view of that battle, with some bits of it being less interesting to certain people and some bits of it being more interesting, but the point of view. Tonit's off to Folkestone. Does that mean you're going across the channel to Europe again, Tonit? We'll see. Love you too, Tonit. Fantastic to hear from you. So that's my long-term thinking is to keep on going. The difficulty in a crowded, competitive market is to keep my head above water financially. Now I wasn't intending to do this on this part of the channel, and I put the banner across of all the new patrons. But each month, when the calendar month turns over, I lose a few patrons because their credit cards or debit cards expire, or they've watched all the content and moved on. So I never quite get beyond. My highest amount of subscribers on Patreon, I think, was June this year, and it's dropped a bit. I'd like to see a few more patrons coming in because I know this is not the little get out their little violins in sympathy for Woody, but I really don't have time for anything else now. I in the first years of doing this, I was still guiding a little bit. Now I've done 4 days of guiding this year. That's all I've done. And I've got my World War II TV week-long or 6-day battlefield tour of Normandy in October. We still have places on that tour. It's from the 2nd to the 9th or something of October. If you are fancying coming over and seeing Normandy with me, there are 3 or 4 places left on that tour. Contact me via one or other of my websites. I don't have time for guiding. This takes an inordinate amount of my time. I love doing it, don't get me wrong, but the amount of content I'm throwing at you in September, as I said earlier, there'll be quite a few days with 2 shows in a day. There's 2 shows today. There's this one, and Guy Walters is coming on at 4 o'clock UK time to begin our war crimes series with a look at the hunt for Nazi war criminals. Okay, so in order to keep moving forward, I could do with some more financial support. I'm making a living, but I'm not really able to save. I'm 56 years. I don't own a house. I haven't owned a house for a few years. I'm in rented accommodation. I've got to move in sometime in the next 18 months. Blah 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 blah. So if a few more of you could sign up for Patreon or YouTube channel membership, that would be really good. The links are always in the description below. Do I want help linking movies to topics? I work in a university library. If you want to, it's going to LinkedIn to get my name. Movies is something I really love. I really love World War II movies, even the bad ones. And I do often drop in references to movies that cover subjects. In the early year of World War II TV, I had more people from the movie industry coming on. I had, We talked about the 442nd with my friend Stacy over in Hawaii, the film she made about the Japanese Americans from Hawaii, the Nisei. Now Fighting on Film, the podcast exists, who are looking at World War II movies. I've again stepped out of that arena slightly because I think there's someone doing it better than I can. But I would, yeah, shows about movies, looking at how movies have influenced history, how history has influenced movies is something I definitely want to do in the future again. The other thing is, I'm trying to write a book this year. I'm not going to go into huge details, but there have been health issues in my family this year that have needed to be addressed. We are coming through that now, but it's meant my attention has been not always fully on World War II TV. My headspace hasn't been right, but my book, when I get back to write again, the research work's still going on, will be about the Battle of La Haye-Dupuy in Normandy, the US 8th Corps, Middleton. That's the 90th Division, 79th Division, 82nd Airborne. We'll touch on the 83rd. We might touch on the 8th Division. Lots of stuff about Das Reich and their involvement of German Fallschirmjäger, the civilian response. I'm working on that. I don't have any kind of idea of timeline. I've just started to write a couple of sample chapters, but lots more work. But it won't be next year, maybe the year after. But I'm working on that. So I think I'm going to head off fairly soon because I've been talking about this to you for about an hour or so. In the end, not as many questions coming in because people are just listening to me ramble, which has been interesting. But the last thing I'm going to say is, having said, if any more of you can become patrons, I've just done that bit there, but also just to thank you, all of you, for being fantastic ambassadors for what we do here on World War II TV. When I have conversations with other content creators, I am proud that my regulars are the best regulars on a YouTube channel, bar none. You are both welcoming to new people in the sidebar. You're self-policing. You call out the people who are the deniers, of Holocaust deniers, the neo-Nazis, that kind of stuff. You're very respectful. People asking what questions that may be a little bit newbies questions. You're very good at doing that. You do ask questions of my guests, but you're not ever trying to trip them up. I'm very, very pleased that that is the case. I think there are some people who watch YouTube or podcasts who are really, really trying to trip that historian up, trying to get them to say the wrong date, picking them up for saying the wrong name or wrong something or mispronouncing something. And, you know, all of us do it all the time. I said in my chat with John McManus yesterday, and the question came out about Lansdale, the American politician. When I read the question out, said Lonsdale. And the reason I did that is I've been reading a book about Arnhem that day, and Lonsdale Force was just in my head, right? And I just made a kind of vocal gaffe. And people do that. They'll go, oh, you said this, and this is you said the 9th when clearly you meant the 8th. Yeah, fuck off. You know, it's a live conversation. Of course, we make little vocal errors and we get things wrong, and we can't sometimes remember the name. Someone pulled up one of the historians in the Norwegian week for not remembering one of the names of someone who came up as an answer to a question in sidebar. So it wasn't a name from the presentation. Someone asked a question and the person couldn't quite remember the name, but they did eventually, I think. And well, for goodness sake, we're all human beings. So I'm very proud that 99.9% of you are fantastic people who are entering into the spirit of what we're trying to do here. You make it very welcoming, as I say to people. There's the spirit is fantastic, and I really, really like that. There are other channels who are plagued with negativity, plagued with, you know, swearing and cursing. I mean, I swear and curse, but coming in about guest presenters. I mean, we get a little bit of stuff where when a woman guest is on, people come on and they're a little bit sexist sometimes. Oh, what a wonderful that such an attractive young lady can talk about. Yeah, don't do that, please. You know, please. If what you're going to say about someone's appearance, you wouldn't be comfortable about saying it's someone of the male sex, don't say it about someone of the female sex, right? So unless you're the sort of person who does find if you're male and you do find James Holland particularly attractive, and you feel the need to say, I liked his talk about Mark Clark, but I also think James Holland is incredibly bangable. If you really need to do that, you can, but I'd rather you didn't. Let's just keep it to looks, to not looks, but to what people said. So there we are. I'm going to leave you all. Yeah, we don't get many of the actually. I'll think you'll find we get a bit of that. We wouldn't be a YouTube channel talking about history if we didn't get a little bit of that. And there are people who love to share in their comments the stuff they know about a subject that we've covered that often isn't necessarily completely connected to how we tackle the subject, but they want to just show off what they know. That's fine. Good with that. Anyway, I'm going to love you and leave you. And I'm going to see you all again the next time I do this. The next Ask Me Anything, I don't know when it'll be, probably October, and it'll probably be more the regular time of day in the evening UK time. Probably, although I might do one, I've said this before, I might do one in like the middle of the night for me, like 3 a.m. for me ish, which would be kind of evening time in the USA, so 7 or 8 p.m. in the USA. I might do that at some time, okay, but I don't know when it'll be. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your contributions. If you, as I said, a few more patrons would be nice. You can do it for just a couple of dollars a month. It's the old cliche. For the price of a cup of coffee, in fact, for the price of a cheap, shitty cup of coffee, you can get all this content. And I had someone email me this morning saying they've been watching my content since the beginning. They love my content, and they did a little drawing, which they sent to me, like a digital drawing as a thank you. But the person said, I've never contributed financially. And I understand that. I completely understand that people can't afford financially. But I would also urge you, if you have watched even as little as 20 shows a year on World War II, right? On World War II TV, just 20, that's 3 a month. Consider how much that would have cost you if you went to cinema or if you were renting videos online or streaming stuff, whatever it would be, you know? So if you are a regular viewer of this and you've never dipped your hand in your pocket, I'm not going to try and make you feel guilty. Just play a little bit of mind games with you. Just think that a little bit of money out of your bank account into my bank account makes me more comfortable doing this. And the more I can do this with no financial worries, the more I will enjoy it. There we are. I will see you all later on when I'm talking to Guy Walters about the hunt for Nazi war criminals. Click like and subscribe. I will see you all later on. Cheers, everybody. Bye.